Good morning, Theories of Abstraction students. Happy Friday. I hope this comes to you in the course of finishing up a productive and enriching week. I wanted to take some time to talk to you about the relationship between abstract painting and icons. It's something that comes up in this week with Russian constructivism and the movement forward in artistic development and in stylistic innovation, and in many cases other forms of artistic and creative innovation. It consists of a reappropriation, a reinterpretation, a re-engagement with the past, with traditional forms or with forms that that are means by which artists and creatives can move beyond the limits of the present, beyond the limits of a tradition that is recognized as authoritative in the present, and get at a certain primitive or archaic or naive or folk approach to the arts and other creative practices as a way of enlivening, as a way of catalyzing and cultivating innovation. And this is certainly something we see with painting, in a re-engagement with the tradition of icon painting, a tradition that is a very different tradition than the tradition of the Western pictorial tradition, a tradition that includes the work of the Renaissance painters, Raphael and Leonardo, Masaccio, the grand manner of academic painting, and the developments that take place within the context of the European academies, and move and return to a way of painting pictures that is shaped not just by Christian faith or the Christian church, but shaped by Eastern Orthodox Christianity, by a practice of Christian liturgy and sacrament for which pictures play a very important role. And so I thought I would take some time to unpack that for you, perhaps offer some reasons why there's this interesting connection with modern artists and artists that are working in various dialects and accents of abstraction are identifying with, and those artists that have particular utopian and political visions are attracted to the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and why that connection is not quite as far-fetched as you might think, and that religion and politics are not as separate as we might think. But first, I want to apologize for not having your responses and your midterms done. It's been a very busy week, and I apologize for the silence on my side. I will scramble today, Friday, and the weekend to read and respond to each of your writings and to get back on track. I apologize for that. Several deadlines were such that I needed to grudgingly set aside my interaction with you for the first part of this week. So one of the things I want to emphasize with the theology of the icon and the importance of the icon in relationship to politics. Many of these artists that we're looking at in terms of of embracing an ideology or a theory of the avant-garde, that the arts are a means of transforming society, that the arts that painting has the potential of catalyzing and initiating revolution, political revolution. That there is a belief that the artistic practice can be involved in political revolution and social transformation, etc. And what is interesting is how Christianity, within the context of the icon and the tradition of the painting of the icon, is a means of injecting art with a political strain. And the issue is ultimately for both the radical politics and radical art of the early 20th century, within which abstraction is playing a fundamental role. The belief that unifies both religion and politics. You could say religion in its true sense and politics in its true sense, or revolution, is that there is a higher authority than the state. That there is a greater other to one that one must be accountable to. That there is a higher ethics than simply the state. In the context of religion, Christian religion, which is what we're looking at, it is God. Or you could say it's Jesus Christ. And you can look in the Gospels and you can see the impact of Jesus, the political impact of Jesus in first century Palestine. That Jesus speaking truth to power, Jesus refusing to respond and keeping silent to Pilate, John the Baptist's radicality when it comes to speaking truth to power to Herod, the Apostle Paul going to Rome and speaking truth to power, and the implication that one will render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but what is not Caesar's you will not render to Caesar. And so the tradition of the saints and the martyrs in the Christian church is a tradition of this kind of political defiance. The refusal to give over everything to the state, to the monarch, to the king. That there is a limit to their power is crucial theologically for the church. Now, in what we see historically, we see the relationship of the church and the state. We see the use of Christ and theology for the purpose of political subjugation and for political purposes. This happens in the present as well. But the radical leftist, Bolshevik, communist, Marxist revolution that characterized artistic practices of the first few decades of the 20th century also claimed that there was a higher authority than the state. And in many ways, what you could say is that socialism, communism, Bolshevism, that kind of radical politics of a radical revolution, is a secular theology. And the secular theology, what the higher authority of the state in this context is the other person, is the other, the community. It's your neighbor. And you could say if the if there are two tables of the law in the Ten Commandments, what we owe to God and what we owe to our neighbor. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself as the golden rule, as the two tables of the law. You could say that what the church is offering and the political radicality of the church is that it is God that is the higher authority, and the neighbor, you could say. We'll talk a little bit about that. And in the context of socialisms and communisms and revolutionary politics, it is neighbor. It is people. What makes communism and socialism and those radical revolutions in many ways a secular theology is that it's simply emphasizing one aspect of this dual focus, this dual radicality of Christianity. That is that the higher authority is God, and God authors the fact that my neighbor is a higher authority. That I love my neighbor, even if the state tells me that my neighbor is an other that I must despise. So the political radicality, say, of those that are working as part of the resistance, liberating the Jews and saving the Jews from the Nazis, the political ramification is that they see the Jew, the German sees the Jew, the German Gentile sees the Jew not as an other, a subhuman, but as a neighbor. And so that act of loving is an act of radicality. What is interesting is that throughout the 20th century and in the Soviet Union, this political activists would try to reactivate the Russian Orthodox past as a means of political revolution. And so the Russian filmmaker, Andrei Tarkovsky, in 1966, released a movie called The Passion of St. Andrei Rublev. Rublev is the most famous icon painter. He was working in the first part of the first decades of the 15th century. He painted the very famous icon called the Holy Trinity, and I have an attachment of that image for you. I've also written a couple short meditations on Tarkovsky and Tarkovsky's film and Rublev's icon that I've also attached as a PDF for you. But Tarkovsky's movie was banned in the Soviet Union. It opened in Paris at the Cannes Film Festival. And it was banned in the Soviet Union because it focuses on a Russian icon painter. And that Russian icon painter became a cipher, a metaphor for the Russian who resisted, whose spiritual strength, spiritual searching, resisted political authority. And so in totalitarian governments, it is the church that is attempted to be stamped out or to be flipped and compromised. And so you have, in Germany, for example, you have the so-called Confessing Church, of which Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were a part. That wasn't just a spiritual act. It was a political act. It was an act of defiance. And so it's not insignificant, and it's not that unusual that artists like Kandinsky and Malevich and others would be attracted to particular points of the Christian tradition, for which the visual arts played an important role, the tradition of the icon, and that the testimony of the saint, the testimony of the martyr, willing to die for their beliefs, the testimony of the desert fathers, of those men and women that left the cities and went out into the desert to do spiritual battle, who served as spiritual guides and advisors for people from the city to come out for guidance. And how that guidance and that presence was a constant source of critique, of social and political critique. Now I want to talk a little bit about this theology and practice of the icon that were attractive to the avant-garde, to many avant-garde artists, and were attractive to artists that were working in various ways in the language of abstraction. First of all, for the icon painter, the emphasis was not representing observable reality in an accurate way, but by representing reality as it truly is, not as it appears. So the very testimony and the existence of the icon is that what you see, that what you believe is not what you see. That there is a spiritual reality that is beyond what you see. And yet the icon painter uses the visible, uses your vision as a means to push you beyond it. So for the Renaissance, the Western theory of painting, the pictorial surface was a picture window through which you watched a natural scene. You watched Jesus coming down from the cross. You watched Achilles or Zeus doing battle. You observed figures interacting in a world that was continuous with you. But the theory of the icon, the pictorial surface of the icon, is a picture window through which you receive the spiritual. The spiritual comes to you. It's reversed. By the use of linear perspective in Renaissance and the Western pictorial theory of picture making, you visually enter into the picture. And so the continuity and the control that you have going into it to observe this scene is facilitated through paint. In the tradition of icon painting, through paint, that pictorial surface is dissolved, but what comes through is not your visuality into that space, it is the subject going out to you, addressing your space. So simply put, you look at a scene from Giotto's Arena Chapel in Padua, and you see Jesus being lamented, the dead Jesus taken down from the cross being lamented by his followers. You enter into that first century Palestinian moment. You reenact that entity, that event. And none of those figures are aware of you. You're observing it. You're one of the observers with the Marys, the lamenting women. The icon is totally different. The icon of Christ is the icon of the resurrected Christ addressing you in your space, in your moment. It is Christ, it's the spiritual reality of Christ presence for you. You aren't going back in time to see the event. You are being ministered in the present with the present reality of the risen Christ who is there to bless you. That is why icons are used as devotional and prayer tools. They're means by which I can be addressed by the risen Christ who is there for me, whose body was broken and blood was shed for me at this moment in my present as I pray. That is reality. The reality is that it may look like what I see in the world around me is injustice, pain, suffering, death. And yet, the true reality underneath it, or just behind it, is that Christ is risen, the kingdom has come, and just as clearly as I can see the risen Christ, I can be sure that my destiny is to be with him. The focal point then is also to present a discontinuity. Linear perspective creates a continuous relationship between my space and the space of the event in Renaissance painting, in the Western pictorial tradition. In the icon, the perspective is reversed, and in fact it's called inverse perspective. It's anti-natural. It goes against those laws of perspective to give us a world that is redeemed, to give us a risen world. That's why you see in the backgrounds of icons, the background figures, no figure is within an architectural structure. If they make reference to an architectural structure like the church, they will hold a model of the church. They are always in the landscape, meaning they are not subjected to human invention. But precisely the opposite, how linear perspective works in the Western pictorial tradition, is that figures are in architecture. They are under arches. They're within the context of architectural structures that facilitate in opening up space. So you could say that the presence of the figures in the Western pictorial tradition emphasizes their bodily presence, material presence here and now, in which we go back in time to see Jesus in the flesh during his passion. In the Eastern tradition of the icon, this perspective is inversed, it's reversed, and the focal point is the spiritual reality. Now, what is interesting is that what the tradition of the icon is doing is a particular form of vision disciplining. It's training our vision to not be deceived by what we see. For example, and so it has an ethical focus. The ethical focus is to see Christ in the face of every single human being. So that what you don't see in front of you is a despised other, a slave, an immigrant, an author, and one of those awful foreigners that our political administration seems to be so adamant of keeping out of this country. We don't see them. We don't see the criminal. We don't see the immigrant. We don't see the black or brown. What we see is the face of Christ. That's the goal of the icon. And the goal of the icon in the physical realm. In the spiritual realm, the goal of the icon is to comfort me that those that have died before me are not dead. They live and reign. They are present with Christ, and they are, as the book of Hebrews says, the great cloud of witnesses. That aspect in Hebrews undergirds the theory, the theology of the saints. That the saints are there on our behalf. They are there to intercede on our behalf. Just like you may ask a friend to pray for you. The Orthodox is asking St. Paul to pray for them. They're interceding on our behalf. They are strengthening us. That they have gone before us and that they bear witness to a spiritual life. And for many artists that wanted to move beyond the limitations of the present, the spiritual, the political limitations of the present, abstraction was a means by which this new language could catechize could shape a new way of seeing, that could somehow be evidence of the potential, the hope, that the way things are may not be the way they always have to be. So I hope these thoughts are helpful to you. I'm particularly struck with this relationship and the contemporary use of the icon as a model for political and social revolution. So if these thoughts are helpful to you, have a good weekend. I will be reading your responses and your midterm reflections and getting back to you as soon as I possibly can. In the meantime, let me know if you have any questions. And we'll be starting now to move towards the final paper. The final paper, around 15 pages, in which you select an artist that we've talked about, or an artist you want to talk about, a subject or various themes that of interest to you that you want to explore with the help of a few artists. You are free to pose your own question that you will then go about answering in your final paper. So your final paper proposal is simply to pose that question for me. What do you want to explore? And I can give you some guidance in that respect. So have a great weekend. Take care.